Let's take some time now to look at some core concepts of environmental health. These include toxicity, exposure, dose response, individual susceptibility, risks and benefits, environmental justice, and community resources in action. Toxicity. This is a word that most of us have heard, but what does it mean? Toxicity is the degree to which a substance, a toxin or poison, can harm a human or animal. Acute toxicity involves harmful effects in an organism through a single or short-term exposure. Chronic toxicity involves negative health impacts that develop after a long-term exposure. We need to remember that toxicity does not necessarily mean deadly. There are different levels of toxicity. Some exposures are relatively benign and do not cause any ill health or other negative effect, while other elements, other compounds are highly toxic and a small amount could cause death. But we speak of toxicity in terms of levels and exposure. So how toxic do you think the compounds are that are lined up to the lower right? I have baking soda, bleach, toilet bowl cleaner, and laundry detergent. Let's take a minute and have you decide which is highly toxic all the way down to not toxic. Is this what you came up with? The bleach is highly toxic. Just a little bit will kill you. Moderately toxic is the toilet bowl cleaner. Slightly toxic the detergent, and not toxic is the baking soda. Baking soda is actually used in cooking, so it's good that it's not toxic. So how did you do? When we speak of exposure, we have to consider how the exposure occurred. Was the toxic element inhaled? Was it ingested? Or did we absorb it through our skin in dermal absorption? All of these factors will determine whether or not an exposure impacts health. It's one factor, but it's an important consideration. Similar to exposure, the dose-response relationship depends on a lot of different factors. The duration of the exposure. If I'm exposed to something for a long period of time, I'm going to have a higher dose of whatever the exposure is to. How frequent is the exposure? How often? And what is my body size? A child cannot endure the same dose as an adult, and their response will be greater than that of an adult. A good example are any of the heavy metals. Children are still developing, so exposure to lead and cadmium has great impact on them, whereas if I were to be exposed to the same amount, it might have little or no impact. As we consider environmental exposures, we also need to consider the individual and if they have specific susceptibilities. Which people may be more vulnerable to certain environmental exposures? For example, pregnant women and developing fetuses are generally more sensitive to exposures than non-pregnant women. Elderly people, their immune systems are not as efficient as when they were younger. Also, sick individuals with weakened immune systems, and infants and children who are still developing. Again, infants and children have brains that are still developing, and so exposure to toxins can have disastrous results.